Ambassador John Bolton is a former national security advisor under the Trump administration. He was also the U.S. ambassador to the UN, serving under George W. Bush. Welcome, Mr. Ambassador. Good to see you again.
Glad to be with you.
As we speak, I like to start with the news. There are reports that Israeli tanks now are in the center of Rafah. And as you know, the ICC, the International Criminal Court, is pursuing arrest warrants not only against Hamas, but against a number of Israelis, including Prime Minister Netanyahu. Why shouldn't they, in your view, be doing that?
Well, the ICC is fundamentally illegitimate. It's an infringement on national sovereignty, particularly for countries that haven't adopted it. It doesn't have any real ability to affect the real world. It's like a piece of government, unaccountable, unelected, unbeholden to any democratic authority, just kind of out there. No executive branch, no judicial branch. It's a pretend court. It's a pretend court like the International Court of Justice, usually called the World Court, and it issues pretend rulings based on a pretend jurisdiction. Here, the pretense is that the ICC has jurisdiction because of the state of Palestine, which doesn't exist. And so they are purporting to go after Israeli officials based on that tenuous hook, even though Israel, like the United States, like China, Russia, and India, have never agreed to the statute, the Rome Statute that creates the International Criminal Court. So this is a kind of fantasy that the world has indulged in for a long time, that courts will resolve international political questions. And legal institutions are no good at resolving political questions. That's why our courts in this country don't touch them, and it's why the very notion of an international criminal court is so inherently political and so unaccountable as it's been created, that I think Israel can just safely ignore what they say.
But why shouldn't that court be empowered, John? Why shouldn't countries like the U.S., and many countries do support the ICC, why shouldn't countries like the U.S. Sign on to serving their arrest warrants and helping them prosecute war criminals, in effect, if that's what indeed they prove to be?
Well, if other countries want to do it, that's up to them. But I regard it as a fundamentally anti-democratic institution. We are a democratic, rule of law, constitutional society, and we hold our leaders accountable when they don't live up to our legal standards. We don't need a bunch of international nannies or platonic guardians who think they have some higher vision of what's right, telling us what to do. That's just not even contemplated in the Constitution. We judge ourselves. We make mistakes. We're human. By the way, so are the judges on the International Criminal Court. Nobody sprinkled angel dust on their heads when they put those robes on to make them completely perfect. And that's the sort of a fantasy that says, well, I can get rid of my responsibility to protect myself and to behave responsibly in the international system by expecting some court's going to take care of everything for me.
So it may be that you get an enemy country or a hostile country that has undue influence over that next panel of judges prosecuting America or Canada or Britain, for that matter.
Yeah, look, nobody has ever shown that the World Court or the ICC has ever deterred a bad guy from doing anything. And that's why the Biden administration rejection of the effort to get arrest warrants for Israeli officials is an unsatisfactory answer. And by the way, the only American politician of any note who supports this decision is Bernie Sanders, which tells you a lot. You can't say we're in favor of a court that goes after bad guys but doesn't go after good guys. And in fact, Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, the Ayatollah Khamenei, Kim Jong-un in North Korea, they couldn't care less what this court does.
Why do you think, in one of the op-eds that you wrote, that this ruling, the issuing of potential warrants against people like Netanyahu, could spell an end to the court?
Well, I've been writing about what's wrong with the ICC for over 25 years, and at a debate in Harvard in the late 1990s, I said the U.S. will not join the ICC within the lifetime of anybody in this room. Now, that was almost 25 years ago. The court has not lived up to anybody's expectations. And now, by going after Israel, a democratic rule of law society fighting against the existential threat of Iranian backed terrorism, is being second guessed by a group of people with no responsibility, no accountability. If they turn out to be wrong on this, having exercised this enormous threat of arrest warrants, where does Israel go to get satisfaction for having been unfairly treated? In the middle of this kind of conflict, to say that there's any warrant for thinking that the ICC is going to make a positive contribution, the argument just doesn't fly.
Well, why do you think it could be the end of the court?
Because I think so many people in this country now see what the court is like in operation. And by going after Israel, it's often said Israel is the canary in the coal mine for the United States, that people go after them first when the real objective is attacking us. So when you have 535 members of the House and the Senate and a big one has spoken up in support of what the court has done, I think that's pretty significant.
Switch gears, your old boss is before the court this week, former President Trump. Regardless of what the court rules, do you still believe that he's unfit to be president? And why don't a lot of Americans agree with you? Because he's still riding pretty high in the polls.
Well, I do think he's unfit to be president, and it's too bad that people who agree with me haven't been able to explain clearly enough why that is. I think this prosecution, which is based on an unfounded and I think erroneous legal theory about what constitutes a violation of federal election law. Remember, this is a New York State court, a New York State prosecutor we're talking about. That an acquittal or a hung jury here will actually help Trump, because it will show that his argument that he's being picked on by the deep state and by the Biden administration may turn out to be true. And if he's convicted, it may help him as well, because it will further prove that he's being picked on by the deep state. I just think if your objective is to make sure that Trump's not elected, you have to bear in mind what his supporters think. And that's why what I've been trying to do is argue why he's unfit. Going after him through what some people call lawfare, I think could turn out to boomerang. It's like you're forgetting the objective. Some people are just so eager to see Trump prosecuted that they're not thinking through that the consequences of the prosecution might actually help Trump politically, whatever the verdict.
Russia and Ukraine, you no doubt are watching the situation, and you're an expert on a lot of this. They're going after Kharkiv. I mean, I think it's heartbreaking to see some of these missiles hitting residential areas and malls and a factory that was binding books. The Russians are increasingly invading from the north, and yet you still have the U.S. administration saying that there are restrictions on the weapons that America have given to Ukraine, not to use them in Russia. Can you assess all of that for me? Is it a mistake in foreign policy right now to keep the handcuffs on Ukraine?
Well, I think it's absolutely a mistake to keep the handcuffs on Ukraine. In fact, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg is now saying the time has come to lift these limits. Really, the time came on February the 24th, 2022, when the Russians invaded. You can't respond to an unprovoked act of aggression like that by saying, I think we'll just fight this war on the territory of the country that's attacked and not go after the territory of the aggressor. I mean, I just think this is a matter of common sense that the Biden administration has badly mishandled under the misbegotten fear that somehow Putin has the capability to make a wider war. If he had the troops and the capability to do that, he would have done it already, or he would have sent these troops into Ukraine, where his army has behaved incredibly poorly. So I think we've put these restraints on ourselves in Ukraine from the beginning of the conflict after the Russian invasion. It was a mistake, like the mistake of doling out different kinds of weapon systems to Ukraine after long, painful debate, not strategically, not thinking how can we help Ukraine achieve victory over Russia, because we've deterred ourselves. We have hampered our own effort for this illusory fear of a wider war.
You don't believe that Putin, well, actually, you're not saying that, so let's clarify. Do you believe that Putin wants a wider war, whether he can mount one or not?
Well, I think he wants to win in Ukraine. He has larger objectives, that's to be sure. But if his military has learned anything, it's that they were not ready for this war when it began, and the notion they would that they would try and spread the war invites what's left of the Russian army from being chewed up as well. And I will say that Putin's nuclear threats, which he has made from time to time, have never shown any redeployment of any Russian nuclear forces. And I think if the administration has done anything, it's tried to convince Putin that it would be disastrous if he did use nuclear weapons. I don't. I think you always take the threat seriously, but I think throughout the past 2+ years here from Moscow, it's been nothing but bluff.
So what does the West do to give Ukraine a victory, Ambassador Bolton?
Well, I think live up to what the stated position of every NATO member is, which is a restoration of full sovereignty and territorial integrity to Ukraine. And by saying, okay, well, if that's the objective, what do we need to do to give Ukraine the wherewithal to do it? I mean, there have been some calls. French President Macron said recently we should consider putting NATO troops on the ground in Ukraine. I don't particularly care if France does that. I don't think he actually means it. But I don't think NATO troops on the ground are required. I think the Ukrainians are prepared to continue to do the fighting. We just have to aid them in a strategic way, which we have not done.
Last question on China. I'm making you work hard here on so many things internationally today, and I appreciate your time. China, of course, by the way, has helped Russia a lot with the use of some of the microchips that are in missiles and tanks and other things. But China has now encircled the island of Taiwan after a very pro-democracy president was elected in the latest election. How should America handle this? Would America come to Taiwan's aid, do you think? And what should be done? I mean, because Taiwan is really being pressured by mainland China.
Well, I think we should be prepared to come to Taiwan's aid, but I think the way to make sure it never happens is to do a lot of things we could do but are not doing to deter China. There's the threat of a Chinese invasion. I actually think that's not the route China would prefer to go. I think the real threat is that Beijing would create some kind of political crisis on some kind of pretext and then throw a blockade around Taiwan and, in effect, defy the United States, Japan, and others to come to Taiwan's aid and break the blockade. And if we don't, then I think Taiwan would fall into China's lap like a piece of ripe fruit, which is really what China wants. They don't want to do to Taiwan what Russia's currently doing to Ukraine. They want all of Taiwan's productive facilities, including particularly the chip fabricators, to come in basically unharmed. So I think we need a lot more thinking and even more than that, a lot more action about how to put Taiwan in a place where Beijing is deterred both from thinking about an actual invasion, but also deterred from even contemplating a blockade. And one way to do that, in my view, is to announce that we're going to home port a couple of American naval bases in Kaohsiung, the biggest port city in Taiwan, basically to show our presence there and to make it clear to China that if they did put a blockade around Taiwan, whatever we think of the Taiwanese, we would have to come to provide security for our own assets there, and that would be something I think that would be a powerful deterrent to China from getting into this to begin with.
Ambassador John Bolton, always great to talk to you. Thank you so much, John.
Well, thanks again for having me.